Hello, welcome to Cool Talk and to the introduction of World War I, the rise of dictators. Now, I do suggest that if you haven't seen it, go back and see the video on League of Nations. It will really help you understand what we're going to be talking about right now. For the moment, let's say this, that after World War I, when it ended, the world had changed completely, and nobody knew how to handle it. Some wanted to go back to the familiar times, happier times before the Great War, but that was not to be. Borders had changed, new nations had risen, systems and monarchies would rise and fall. There was no going back, but nobody knew what going forward would mean. And as everybody struggled, along came the stock market crash of 1929. Economic depression set in and paved the way for the rise of dictators. After World War I, Italy was suffering high unemployment, and socialism was a new wave. Following the examples of the Bolsheviks in Russia, Italians seized factories and called strikes. Communism, however, failed to take root, but conditions grew worse and along came Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had been attracted to politics his whole life. He had been a newspaper editor, elementary school teacher, and now was an organizer of a new party, the Fascist Party. Fascism is a different type of dictatorship where private property and enterprise is allowed but tightly controlled by government regulations. Mussolini championed the masses, promising to improve working conditions, so he got a following. He would tax the rich. But because he also attacked communism, he also attracted support from the rich landowners who feared losing it all to the communists. Now, the Fascist Party wasn't growing fast enough, so Mussolini called out his little squad of, I'm going to call them thugs. They were called the Black Shirts. They would go out there and bully political opponents through beatings or forcing them to drink castor oil. And of course, things were swaying Mussolini's way. Now, the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel II, he feared that the communists would take over. So he, along with the upper middle class and the rich, supported Mussolini and made him prime minister. By 1924, the fascists had won 65% of the votes in the parliament. But then there was a serious setback when Giacomo Matteotti, a political opponent, was murdered by the fascists. Now, Mussolini had lost popularity because of this. So what did he do? He silenced the press until things died down and people kind of forgot about it. So now, being prime minister, having absolute power, and now being known as El Duce, Mussolini set up public works programs. Roads, stadiums, houses, schools. He improved industry and farming. He enlarged the military and in turn ended unemployment for thousands. Propaganda was widespread, including using school textbooks to glorify the cause. But then along came 1930. The worldwide depression had set in and put a damper to the growing Italian venture. Now remember that Japan had previously entered World War I because it needed raw materials to satisfy the growing population. But this problem did not go away. Japan was still eyeing China territory with interest. In the 1920s, Japan was being introduced to Western democracy, but it didn't like it. It still had an emperor, but the parliament was beholden to the prime minister. Now, this is the emperor of Japan at the time, Hirohito. He became emperor at a very, very young age. And the term emperor in Japanese is Tenno, which means heavenly sovereign, because the Japanese believed that their emperor was a kind of god, actually a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. But the real power in Japan was the prime minister. Now, the military was becoming more and more powerful and more independent. It didn't like the pacifist, moderate policies that the parliament and the prime minister had with China. The Japanese people felt that democracy was to blame for their troubles. They didn't like the Western democracy that was introduced in the 1920s. So the Depression of 1930 again caused more hardships, and while warlords seized more power, fanatics furthered their aims. And the liberal Prime Minister Yugo Hamaguchi was assassinated, and now the military was in control. Their goal? To build an army and a navy second to none in the East. In Germany was suffering quite a bit. Everybody blamed the Treaty of Versailles, where they had to pay war reparations because of World War I. They had to give up land, they had to disarm, and they had to pay billions and billions and billions of dollars that they frankly could not afford. After World War I, the Weimar Republic was adopted in 1919. It was democratic for the most part, but there were too many political parties, and it was hard to get laws passed. So, in 1925, Paul Hindenburg was elected president. He was a famous general from World War I, a symbol of the old militarism, and he hated democracy. So the military, and many other people as well, blamed the Treaty of Versailles for its economic woes. The military blamed the chaos on liberals and pacifists and Jews. Many believed that the nation's wealth was controlled by rich Jews, so they were envied and even hated. Now, the young blamed their parents' generation for accepting the treaty in the first place. The middle class by then had lost its clout to inflation and unemployment. And into this stage in history enters Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been born in Austria. He lived most of his life in poverty, worked as a draftsperson, and fought in World War I. During the war, he landed in the hospital, blind and suffering the effects of poison gas. It was here where he learned of Germany's surrender. He was so angry and disappointed, he almost committed suicide. He hated the new German government. He hated the Versailles Treaty, and he hated the Jews. In April 1920, the National Socialist German Workers' Party was born, the Nazis, and Hitler would join. Now, in his first party mass meeting, Hitler gave a rousing speech. And if you look at these pictures over here, you can see Hitler rehearsing for his speeches. Hitler became a great orator. He was able to move the masses. And he said that if Germany had not been stabbed in the back by traitors, they would have won World War I. He said that Jews had manipulated the economy to ruin Germany, that Jews could never be loyal to Germany, and that Germany must be strong again. Now, the Weimar Republic had failed. There were too many political parties. There were extreme leftists, extreme rightists, and that demanded change. So Parliament never got a democratic majority. The economy was in shambles before the Republic even got started, and the 1930s Depression aggravated the problem. There were 6 million unemployed Germans in 1932, high inflation and high unemployment. Many felt that World War I could have been won. Hitler had convinced them. Market loans were hard to get because of the war reparations they had to pay. Now, look at this picture right over here. People carrying a basket full of money. Wouldn't you want to have that? Well, it's basically worthless. Hyperinflation had done its job. In 1920, $1 US was equal to 50 German marks. But by 1923, $1 was equal to 4.2 trillion German marks. Germany was in serious trouble. So the Nazi Party grew, and along with it, Hitler gained more and more popularity. They decided to overthrow the government, and they would start with Munich in Bavaria. About 2,000 Nazis participated with Hitler in trying to take over the government in Munich. 600 Nazis surrounded the beer hall. Hitler entered and told everybody there that the revolution had begun. Buildings were seized, but the police came along and ambushed them. Hitler was wounded. 16 Nazis were killed. Riots broke out. And it was here that Hitler was arrested, and he was sentenced to 5 years for treason. But he only served 9 months, during which he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, an autobiography and a manifesto. Hitler decided that an armed revolution was not the way to go. So he pursued his goals politically. His power grew as a hope against hunger and communism, and in 1933, President Hindenburg named Hitler Chancellor of Germany. The Third Reich was born. He was given dictatorial powers, so he outlawed trade unions, dissolved political parties, nationalized businesses, and opened labor camps. President Hindenburg died in 1934. Hitler abolished the office of the presidency and was now the sole leader of Germany, the Führer, the leader. Now, Hitler believed that there were mass differences among the races, and the Germans, being Aryans, were the master race. Jews were targeted to be eliminated from German life. Businesses outlawed, boycotted, citizenship deprived, and many gave up property and left Germany. And if you look at this propaganda right over here, this poster, you can see how Hitler propagated the notion that Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union supported the Jews. And speaking of propaganda, let's look at all these posters that Hitler threw out there to show the German people how wonderful they are and how good things were going to be. Now, Hitler did end unemployment. Germans joined the organization. They joined the Nazi Party. Food was rationed. All objects had to be held, recycled, or reused as Germany strove to be self-sufficient. Many outsiders, including national leaders, admired Germany's discipline and efficiency. Now, to be fair, Japan, for over 200 years, had been somewhat self-sufficient. They practiced isolationism, and that was until the United States and Western nations came along and almost forced them to trade with them. So Japan got a taste of Western goods. After that, the economy went down. Now, Japan began to eye Manchuria, right over China, right over here. It invaded Manchuria and northern China. And it was here that we have to talk a little bit about the Japanese invasion of China and what they call the Rape of Nanjing. Millions died, and atrocities were committed, experimentation, labor camps, and so forth. So why is it that we're learning about this fairly recently? Well, after World War II, everybody talked about the Nazis. Few talked about Japan, because we were dealing with Japan, trying to raise their economy, trying to help them out. How would it look if we let this information go public? But public it is. Now, the amount of dead Chinese went from between the numbers of 3 million to 14 million. Nobody really knows. What we do know is that China did not give up, but 50 million Chinese moved over to the western part of the country to continue the battles. The League of Nations would condemn these acts of aggression, but Japan decided it would no longer belong to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations, in turn, could do nothing. Mussolini wanted raw materials and military glory, so Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The Italians used poison gas, heavy artillery, Air Force bombing squads, and Ethiopia didn't have a chance. It fell in 1936. Hitler renounced the Treaty of Versailles. He said that the other nations did not hold up their end. They were supposed to disarm. They hadn't done so, so therefore Germany would not pay the war reparations that they were required to do. In March of 1936, Hitler sent his troops into the Rhineland and took it. Now, the Rhineland was kind of a no man's land, a buffer between France, Belgium, and Germany. Other nations and the League of Nations condemned the action. But Mussolini did the opposite. On October 27, 1936, he went along and signed an alliance with Adolf Hitler. They were now a team. Now, the Spaniards had overthrown the monarchy in Spain in 1931, and they set up a republic. But the republic faced poverty and political unrest. And along came General Francisco Franco with his military chiefs to revolt against the republic. And the Spanish Civil War began. Franco and his fascist group fought the loyalists and the communists who joined them. Hitler and Mussolini sent troops over to help Franco, and by March of 1939, Franco had captured Madrid and the Republic fell. And where was the rest of the world during all of this? Neutral. They didn't want to get involved, and they had their own problems. After World War I, France enjoyed 10 years of prosperity. There was an influx of tourism. But then came the Depression of 1930. It changed everything. Riots broke out against corruption. The economy, of course, was bad like the rest of the world. And with its weak political system, governments came and went, and everybody feared Germany. Britain wanted to remain pacifist, and Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, practiced appeasement. The United States would continue its policy of isolationism. It did not want to get involved in European conflicts. You can see my videos on Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt to see the steps taken to fight the Great Depression. Now, Germany had signed a non-aggressive act with Japan, and Japan had signed one with Italy. So these agreements were a defense against Russia, but were really designed for aggression and expansion. In 1936, Hitler's troops invaded Austria, his homeland, and the world did nothing to stop him. Then Hitler began to look at Sudetenland, this little piece of brown area you see on this map here between Germany and Czechoslovakia. Hitler said that there were ethnic Germans living there and that it belonged to Germany. Now, Neville Chamberlain of Britain met with Hitler, and it was agreed that Sudetenland could belong to Germany as long as the Czechoslovakian borders would be decided at a conference, so everything was okay. By now, Germany had the largest land mass in Western Europe, and it began to eye Czechoslovakia, even though it had promised before to keep its hands off. So Chamberlain from Britain went along, shook hands with Hitler, and said, okay, fine, you can have Czechoslovakia, but don't take anything else. And by the way, Czechoslovakia was not invited to this meeting. So German troops marched into Czechoslovakia, and the world looked on and did nothing. Well, you can see where this is going. Hitler now had his eyes on Poland, but in order to take Poland, first he had to contend with the Soviet Union. So what he did was he signed a pact with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. They agreed that they would not fight each other. Instead, they would each invade Poland and divide it among themselves. So Poland was invaded from the east and from the west. Now, the Poles were very courageous, very brave. They made a stand, but they were no match for the Soviets and the Germans. By now, even Chamberlain had seen that appeasement was not working. Britain and France began to arm themselves and prepare to what was going to become the biggest war that the world had ever known, World War II, where between 70 to 85 million people would die. And we'll talk about that in my next video. But in the meantime, send me your comments, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.